Try that again. There it is. All right. Y'all are going to have to listen really closely tonight. That being said, this is as loud as I've been in 3 days. So Angela's like, this is great. And no, I don't feel bad. I've not felt bad this entire time. Throat didn't hurt. Just didn't have much of a voice. So I'm sipping on some hot tea and lemon. And maybe we'll get through. Maybe we won't. We'll just see. Glad to have you guys here tonight. We are, of course, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. And we will actually not quite wrap up tonight, but we will wrap up next week. And then in March, we will begin our series on called A Reasonable Faith I've been talking to you guys about the last couple of weeks. So that'll be in 2 weeks from tonight. We'll start that. So tonight we're in chapter 3 of 2 Thessalonians. We're going to begin in verse 6 and work our way down to verse 15. If I could have someone tonight who would volunteer to read that out loud to give me at least a few moments of not having to talk. 6 to 15. All right. Bob, would you lead us in a word of prayer? Amen. Well, obviously, Paul's getting ready to wrap up this letter. And here in verse 6, he kind of seems to, it's almost like he's got one more last thought. It almost seems unattached to what came before it. He's got this one more thing he wants to deal with. He just talked about in the previous couple of verses, however, that he's confident that the church there in Thessalonica will be obedient to all that he's commanded them, and that the Lord would direct them. He's confident in these two things. And so it's almost like he's setting them up. Y'all ever set anybody up? He's setting them up. He goes, I know you're going to do everything I've said. Now, here's one more thing I'm going to tell you to do. So he sets them up to knock him off that tee, so to speak. So this is what he does. And the topic he brings up sort of feels like it's kind of out of the blue, because he hasn't really talked about anything quite like this to this point in this letter, and really even in 1 Thessalonians. And the issue here seems to be work, or at least work-related, the idea of putting some time and some labor in. And so as we read this just now, Paul's talking about what seems to be a group of people in the church that are not wanting to do their fair share, we might think of it. Now, this is one of those passages that, you kind of want to know what's happening in the background. You'd like to know what it was or what it is that kind of prompted Paul to talk about this. And the best we can tell, it sounds like it might be something that, he wrote that first letter, when news was brought back to him about how things are going, he kind of got whiff of this particular issue and wanted to throw this in and tackle it. That's probably what happened. Now, the trick is trying to figure out what exactly is going on here? We know at baseline there seems to be a group of people that Paul's unhappy with that seem to not be working, or at least not working in the way they're supposed to, or something along these lines, not providing for themselves. The question we kind of have walking into this is, why? What's the context of this? And because that affects how we understand these instructions. Most New Testament and biblical historians will point to one of 3 or 4 different likely scenarios they believe are behind this passage of Scripture. The first one is this. This is the one I first remember hearing, is this. That in the previous chapter, we obviously were dealing with eschatology. We were dealing with things about Christ's return. And there seems to be, there's some Bible historians that believe that there was a group of folks that either because they were concerned they had missed Christ's return, or believing Christ's return was so close, so imminent, that what was the point of going to work? If he's coming back next week, take the rest of the week off, right? And let's face it, if we knew Christ was coming back on Friday, would you go to work tomorrow? Maybe. Depends on if there's someone there you want to make sure is ready. If you knew the war was going to end on Saturday, you probably would do some things differently between now and then. You might not go into work. And so there's that idea that maybe there were some in the church that had gotten the idea that Christ, either they'd missed it or he was coming back just any moment. And so why bother going to work? And of course that didn't happen, so they were perhaps living off the generosity of others in the church. Now, that's pure speculation. There's nothing in the text that even remotely indicates that. That's just an idea that's out there. Another idea is this, that, and Paul kind of talks about this near the end of this passage, that he talks about verse 11 and 12, talks about them being undisciplined and just need to work. Maybe they're just a group of lazy folks. That hasn't gone away. We probably occasionally come across that even today, so maybe there's just a bunch of lazy folks there in the church, and he's trying to address it. Maybe that's a possibility. Again, we don't know for sure. A couple other ideas were this. There were, such as Paul himself, there were, we know of, from other letters like 1 John and other places, there were any number of, in the early church, even by this point in time, traveling teachers, preachers, evangelists, whatever you want to call, who would actually move from church to church, ask for a little support, and try to do some preaching and teaching to do their thing. There were quite a few false teachers and false preachers and false prophets that got mixed into this. And this is one of the issues the early church was often dealing with. Again, the Apostle John deals with this in his letters. Paul deals with it a couple different times as well. So some have speculated that there might be some traveling preachers and teachers. Remember, Paul even warned them earlier in chapter 2 that even if someone shows up claiming to be a messenger from Paul, don't believe them. So it's very possible there may have been some guys showing up claiming to be Paul's messengers or just traveling, whatever. And in the process, they weren't doing their thing. They weren't working. The fourth idea is this. There was in that Greek-Roman culture of the first century, it actually had been around for several hundred years. It was a pretty ingrained part of that time in history in that world culture. It had been for hundreds of years. Something called patronage. Now, what a patron was generally somebody who was wealthier, had more money, had more resources, and they would take on clients. We might call them they would sponsor someone who generally was probably not particularly wealthy. And there might be a couple of different aspects to this. That might be that these were essentially folks who were on the low income side of things and they were going to help them out. And of course, if I help you out, then, you help me out. It's all kind of done unofficially. This is not done, in a written contract or anything. So a patron might have a couple people they're sponsoring. Kind of makes them look good because they're helping someone who doesn't have much food to have something to eat. And in return, this individual might run errands for them, do work, whatever it might be. Not in any official employment capacity, but just, someone you could do favors for. Also, this worked in the realm of teachers. We think of philosophers in that part of the world. We think of things like Socrates and Aristotle and all these guys. Well, often local philosophers and teachers or wise men or whatever you want to call them who would go around trying to, particularly promote their approach to the universe, so to speak. Wasn't a lot of money in that. And so they would find, as has often been the case throughout the centuries, a patron, someone who would fund their work and whose name could be attached to their philosophies and their teachings and their influence. And in return, that teacher or that philosopher or that whoever that might be would lend their name to make their patron look important and look good. There could even be political aspects to this. If this patron who's got all this money is sponsoring some people, and say he's sponsoring some guys who are maybe not rich, but at least have good reputations as far as their speaking abilities or their philosophies or whatever else, those folks might help the rich guy run for politics, make him look good, talk about him in public. And so the idea was in this patronage system, which was ingrained into the Greek-Roman culture, is you had essentially richer folks bankrolling either for charity-type purposes or for political or image purposes, others who kind of, unofficially did them nice things and made them look good. So many have speculated that was going on, since it was part of the culture at large. It might have been going on even inside the church. We don't know what the scenario is. Paul doesn't give us any details. All we know there's this basic idea. We don't really know what's happening. My speculation would be this. The first two things I gave you as possibilities, the one related to eschatology, the one related to people not working because they thought Christ might be coming back next week, or just lazy people. That could be the case. I would tend to move away from those, and I would tend to lean towards one of the latter two ideas, the traveling teacher evangelist idea or the patronage system. And the reason is because how Paul goes about dealing with this particular topic. And what Paul's going to do in dealing with this topic is he's going to tell them, these people shouldn't be doing this because what did I do when I was there? And so Paul is holding up his own situation and how he handled himself as the model for how these people should act. Well, Paul wasn't failing to work in Thessalonica because he thought the Lord was coming back next week. He wasn't just lazy. But Paul might fit into one of those last two categories. And so since he's using his life as a model for how to handle the situation, I would tend to think it might be one of those last two categories. I'm not going to die on that hill, but that's just kind of my 2 cents. So if we're approaching it from one of those two angles, I think it would help us to figure out what's happening here. Let's begin there back in verse 6. Now, he gives them a command, and he begins by keep away from every brother who... Now, the translation she read had the word idol. There are times that certain translations, I think the NIV is one of those, it's a good translation, I'm not going to knock it, but they are interpreting as much more so than sometimes they're translating. The word actually means unruly. Now, the way they may have been unruly was to not be working, so that's where the word idle comes from. But what it literally means is picture a group of soldiers marching down the road, and there's one of them who just won't stay in line. That's where the word unruly comes from. So, those of you who've ever taught in school, and there are lines in class, and there are lines in the hallway, are there ever any unruly kids? In fact, there probably always are. Those that just will not stay in line. Well, the picture Paul's painting here is this. He goes, you need to watch out for these, or you don't have to really watch out for them. They're usually pretty obvious. We have a caution here against those who are living an unruly life. In other words, they are not in line with the way they should be behaving and acting. They're out of line. They're out of step. They're veering off left or right. And some of you are going, I like that person. Some of you are going, I am that person. Well, maybe in some context that's fine. When even now, when I go hiking or I used to go snow skiing, snow skiing, they always have, there are marked trails when you go snow skiing. But it's fun to get off the trail. Sometimes you see signs that says, don't go here. And was a sign, I remember when I was 16, and I'm snow skiing, and you see a sign that says, don't go here, what do? Yeah, because that's what you do when you're 16, right? What do they not want me to see? And sometimes you find out it's a 8-foot snow drift that's you're going to sink into up to your chest. Oh, okay. So, those people sometimes are obvious. I'm not talking about stuff like that, obviously. But we're talking about those who know what they're supposed to be doing. They know the direction they're supposed to be going in, and are just not doing it. They're unruly. And so the first question would probably be then, in what way are they unruly? Well, this is what the rest of this section tells us. And he says they're leading an unruly life, not according to the tradition which you received from us. So there is something that Paul has specifically talked to them about in the past. Now, the topic he's getting into right here has not been addressed in this letter. So it's something he's talked to them in the past about, that there are those in the church who are not doing it. And so he goes, I've told you about this. I've given you instructions. We've talked about the word tradition before last week, and the word tradition here has the idea of these things have been passed down through the Scripture and through the apostolic teaching, the teaching of the apostles, through the teachings of Paul. These things have authority. So these are the things they're talking about. So they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so he tells them to kind of keep their distance from these folks. He's going to get back at the end. He says, verse 7, for you know what you're supposed to be, how you ought to follow our example. So when he says keep away, there at the end of this whole section, he talks about verse 14, he says, do not associate with them, and yet do not regard them as an enemy, but do this as a brother. So this is not that extreme church discipline we might think about excommunicating somebody. This is not that. The idea in this verse has the idea of being cool, being aloof, being distant. Listen, kind of feels cold, but it's giving somebody the cold shoulder, so to speak. It's not refusing to be around them. It's not even being rude. It's just we're not right with each one another right now, and letting them know that. And letting them know that in no uncertain terms. This is what Paul's telling them to do. Now, that may seem a little harsh, but we're going to get back to why he's telling them that. But the idea here is if you find this individual who is essentially trying to live off the generosity of the church without pulling their own weight when they can, don't be all chummy with them. Keep them at a distance here. And the idea really will be ultimately to shame them into doing the right thing. Now, we're going to get back to that, but it says, anyway, stay away from them. So why would that happen? Why would Paul and the New Testament be so concerned with a few people not carrying their weight, so to speak, when it comes to just working and taking care of themselves and living off the generosity of others? Why would they be still concerned that it gets addressed here? Okay. Okay. It can have a bad influence. In fact, that will actually be directly addressed in this text here in just a few moments. Okay? So that's a bigger point there. The church has a responsibility to protect itself. Why? Okay? the Lord's. There's sheep. Sheep aren't the best decision makers. Okay. And the church is supposed to be supposed to look after itself, not just in this instance, but as a general rule, in part because we're to be about the business of glorifying and making known the character of God. I don't think anybody's going to characterize God as lazy. We want to properly represent the gospel. We want to properly represent our Lord. And so whether it's in this instance or some other moral issue, whether it's the way we treat one another, all these different things are going to kind of come into that. By the way, this is this whole idea is the idea behind church discipline. Now, that's not, I'm not going to get down to church discipline to a big deal. That's really not the point. But probably one of the things the church in the last 100 years has not done very well is church discipline. Now, when we think of church discipline, probably what do we think of? Okay. I think I have seen maybe two instances of church discipline in my lifetime. One, I was a teenager at a church that my dad was pastoring, and we had a deacon who had he got caught in a fairly open affair with someone he worked with. And he was unrepentant, was in the process of divorcing his wife, so they exercised church discipline on him. Not only ultimately didn't just remove him from being a deacon, they removed him from the membership of the church. And then our previous church, we had a couple of instances there as well. One also dealt with an extramarital affair, and then one dealt with another individual who threatened violence against somebody else in the church. And so both those instances, ultimately the individuals involved had their names removed from the roll, and because they were generally not just unrepentant, they were defiant in those things. In my 50-something years of life in church, that's the only 3 times I can remember that. And those are all, each one of those kind of ones that were so glaringly obvious you couldn't not do something. Sorry for the double negative, but the church's hand was forced, whether they wanted to do something about it or not. The New Testament doesn't just dwell on this, but the New Testament does bring this up 2 or 3 times about the idea that the church is supposed to be about the business, to a certain degree, of keeping itself pure. In 1 Corinthians, Paul talks quite a bit to the Corinthian church and says, basically, you guys need to stop worrying about what's going on in the world and clean your own house. Kind of like Jesus telling him to, don't worry about the splinter in someone else's eye when you got a log coming out of your own. And of course, the church at Corinth, we know, had a son with an incestuous relationship with a stepmother. And they were just going, yeah, congratulations. So Paul was really going at him for that. And Paul's issue is the church's role as a representative of the risen Christ and the God of heaven is such that we should be concerned about our purity. We should be concerned about our holiness. It should be something of concern to us. That doesn't mean we're hunting down and trying to turn everybody in every time we think they say the wrong thing. That's not what we're talking about. But the church is supposed to be involved with accurately representing who God is. And so Paul deals with this here in this particular context about work. And so what's happening here? One of the things we also know was going on. If we go back to the book of Acts, one of the very first, Acts chapter 7, one of the very first conflicts in the church in Jerusalem is over what? Y'all remember? It's where the deacons first kind of get mentioned in the New Testament. remember what the issue was? First time we have any record of a conflict in the church. Yep. It's about the food distribution. The church made it a regular habit. Now, obviously, the culture is different, the times are different, technology is different, the way the economy works is all different. All those things are markedly different than what we deal with today. But what they were doing was you had those with means in the church, and there in Jerusalem, giving food and resources to buy food on a daily basis so that those who did not have food or could not support themselves had something to eat. And generally speaking, in that day, it was widows and orphans. Because generally a widow, especially if she's of a certain age, didn't have a way of making any money if her husband had died. So she could find herself in a real different, if she didn't have any sons, she could find herself in a pretty desperate situation pretty fast. Orphans the same way. So the conflict became over that there were local Jewish Christians, and then there were Jewish Christians who'd come from other parts of the Greek Empire, Roman Empire, who were called Hellenized Jews. They were Jews, but they had not been raised in Israel. They'd been raised in Greece or in Carthage or in Egypt or somewhere. And so the argument was that those of us who come from out of town are getting shortchanged and getting looked over in favor of the ones who are local. And so it's had to do with the distribution of food. Now what we know is, not just from the biblical record, there are other times Paul talks about something similar, but we even know from outside Bible sources, from early church history, just from writings about people who were involved in church and leaders and all those things in the first couple centuries, we know that generally speaking, the church had a reputation, no matter where they were at, whether they were in Rome, whether they were in Ephesus, whether they were in Jerusalem. The church had a reputation for taking care of its people. They had a reputation for, on a daily basis, distributing food to those members who did not have food. The church was known for that. That's a pretty good reputation to have. Now, we're going to assume the same thing was happening in Thessalonica. And so it may appear that what's happening here is that this church's reputation for being willing to take care of its own has some people in that church saying, well, they're going to take care of me. Whatever their situation, whether it's a patronage issue, whether they're a traveling evangelist, or whether they're just lazy, well, I can live off this. And doing exactly that. And so, as you might well imagine, at some point, if you're the one providing this food, you're probably happy to do it to a degree, but when you see it being distributed to somebody who just doesn't want to work, when they can, that probably begins to sow a little bit of irritation and division, wouldn't it? Sure. And if you have a church that's angry with itself, if you have a church that's divided against itself from sin or for anything else, what happens to that church's effectiveness? Sure. If when I go into a fellowship time and understand that we're talking, London's not a big town, but obviously the culture at that point in time is everyone lived pretty close by. You walked pretty much everywhere you went back then. So a church was pretty much constituted of people who all lived within a few miles of one another. You probably saw each other, if not daily, at least several times a week. And we're kind of used to just seeing each other once or twice a week, perhaps. But they saw each other every day. They worked with each other. They hung out with each other. They, in many ways, because the church was an isolated community, because they were so few in number, and most people thought they were nuts for believing that God rose from the dead. They were outcast often, so they only had each other. If you only have your group of 50 or 100 people, that's all you got left. And now, there's division on that. That's a problem, isn't it? And if on top of that the world's looking at you and your message is getting lost because you're fighting or because there's immorality, or like you see how that all damages the reputation of Christ as well as the focus of the church. So this is why Paul deals with it. And then Paul takes several verses here and he essentially holds himself up as an example. He says that he and his team, when they showed up, while they had the right, and he says even perhaps the expectation they could have allowed the church to support their work, Paul says we did not do that. Paul says we worked on our own and did ministry kind of, today we call them bivocational. But this is what Paul did. He goes, I did this exactly for this reason, so that you wouldn't do what you're doing now. He goes, I did this so that those of you who might be tempted to not work would have an example about what you're supposed to do. So Paul says, Paul's basically saying, listen, I worked overtime just to make sure y'all wouldn't do this, wouldn't be lazy, and yet it's happening. So he gives them some rules. So whether it's patronage, whether it's other traveling teachers, whatever it might be, he says this: they should follow our example. If they want to eat from somebody's house, they should pay them for it. Don't be a burden to anybody. And if the people who are coming in, whether it be a patronage or whether it be a traveling teacher or whatever the situation may be, if they are unwilling to work, don't feed them. I remember my dad was in the ministry for years. And when I first started in the ministry, one of the things you get pretty quickly is people asking for stuff from time to time. And usually primarily it's non-church folks. It's people from the community come and want to see a church as an avenue of getting something, and that's fine. We don't mind helping people. But I remember pretty early on going, okay, Dad, how, you've been doing this for a long time. How do you go about the business of determining who to help, how much to help, all that type of stuff? Now, my dad, obviously, he's a little old school. So what he would do, like the last church he was at, they literally had a pile of rocks in the back of the property. I remember seeing it. It was just a good 4 or 5 foot tall. We just dumped a pile of rocks out there. And he would say, if somebody wanted help, we need those rocks moved from there to there. Now, he wouldn't tell them why. He would just tell them, I need those rocks moved from here to here. If you do that, I can get you whatever you need. He said if they were willing to do it, they'd help them out. And if they were not, they could move on. Now, obviously, not everyone probably could do that, but that was something he kind of used. Especially, I would imagine if there's some 20-year-old guy coming in and asking for help, that's probably what he would do. I've never done that. I've never had a big pile of rocks in the back of the church. Maybe we should get some. I don't know. But at least, willing to work. So Paul puts that out there. He goes on there in verse 11, to your point a while ago, Steve. Not only were there a group of people not working, they were interfering with other people's lives. In fact, there's actually, in the Greek, there's a play on words here, and you can probably recognize it there in verse 11. It says, they're doing no work at all by acting like busybodies. In Greek, it really has the idea of, it really means they're not busy, they're being busybodies. It's a little play on words there. Now, I don't have to probably define that word for you. You probably know exactly what a busybody is. Seen enough sitcoms through the years or just whatever else. You know what a busybody is. And the idea here is they are simply, these folks, whatever the circumstances were, and honestly, if they're in the patronage, if this whole patronage idea is happening, one of the things that would happen in that patronage cultural thing was that those who were being sponsored would, encourage others to like their guy, like the guy who's sponsored, like the patrons. And if there's any politics going on, if there's any influence peddling going on, if there's anybody who just wants to be important or well-known or well-liked, the people they're sponsoring would go out of their way to kind of talk them up in every circumstance. So you can see if this was going on in the church, you can see how it wouldn't take long for a couple different patrons to have competing groups of people trying to talk this guy up versus that guy up. And again, problems. And they would do it, and there's, you could be out there sewing some garments, being a blacksmith, whatever your job is, and some guy walks up and just wants to talk your ear off about somebody else over here and badmouth somebody else over here, and you're just saying, get out of my face. Busybodies. What else do busybodies do? Gossip. Spread rumors. What's that? Cause dissension. They gossip. They just talk about things they don't really know anything about, just to see if they can cause problems sometimes. And so, not only are they not working, they're actively causing problems and getting in the way of other people who are trying to work. Now, it'd be nice to say this was a problem that died in the first century. I think most of us have been around enough to know that this problem still can exist in churches. This can still take place. So, they're not working. They're living off the generosity of the church, who has a reputation for being generous. They are causing dissension and problems, perhaps even spreading rumors, and busying them about things that have nothing to do with them. They're just sticking themselves in the middle of stuff. Potentially so. So, verse 11, he calls them, this is an undisciplined life. Again, remember that picture of the Roman soldier, the soldiers marching and somebody being out of order. Lack of discipline. And I was not in the military. Any of you in the military, you ever served in the military, if you're walking in line, if you're marching in line, and all of a sudden you decide to do your own thing, what are the consequences? Potato peeling for a couple days? Well, and the idea is what's the idea behind peeling potatoes for a couple days? Why is it a punishment? Okay. Is it meant to embarrass you even a little bit? Sometimes, from what I've read or been a part of it, other things, even while I was ever in the military, I've just played sports and on teams, and sometimes coaches would take this approach. One guy messes up, or he would divide you up into groups. One guy messes up, even if everyone else did everything perfectly, the one guy makes everyone have to, because your reactions don't just affect you, they affect everybody else around you. And part of that was that the last thing you want to do is not just embarrass yourself, but the last thing you want to do is make everyone else pay for what you did. Yep. So there's Oh, okay. So this is where we get here to this next thing. Here's Paul's solution to this. If they don't do this, verse 14, don't associate with them. That's the idea of being aloof. Don't be chummy with them. Don't treat them like everything's okay. So that they will be put to shame. So they'll be embarrassed. Now for us, shame is not a pleasant word, is it? That's not a pleasant idea. Now we can be embarrassed, but embarrassed and shame aren't even the same thing either, are they? I can be embarrassed because I fell down the stairs. I know I've come close every couple of times. It's almost, angels over there going, oh no. If I tell one of my dad jokes, Ben and Matthew are generally like, oh. How does shame differ from embarrassment? Has guilt attached to it. Embarrassment, probably something silly happened to me, something I didn't want to do happened to me, like being clumsy. Okay. Nobody wants to be embarrassed, but okay. But shame, we really don't want to be shamed, do we? So that means there was actually something wrong. Okay. Shame isn't just a few seconds of being embarrassed, is it? Shame is, I guess one of the first things I think of outside the Bible. Y'all ever read The Scarlet Letter in high school? Y'all remember The Scarlet Letter, that book? Nathaniel Hawthorne. And of course, the character Hester Prynne is, accused of being an adulteress, so she has to wear the scarlet A on her. And the idea is to shame her. Not embarrass, it's to shame her, in theory, to change her behavior. Now, obviously, the book is going to portray this as a kind of not a pleasant, not a right situation, but Paul's thing here is, and understand this, our culture here in the United States, our culture in the western part of the world right now in this century, we are not an honor shame. We're not a culture that really talks about shame much. We're guilt innocent, not honor shame. But even today, many cultures of the world, they are less concerned about guilt and innocence than they are more concerned about honor and shame. I may have brought this example up even in the scriptures. I understand, even the first century Israel was more of an honor-shame culture than it was a guilt-innocence culture. And by that I mean this. Your actions were not only yours. Your actions would be attached to, if you're a student, your teacher, or to your child, your family, or whatever. And so you were deemed a certain type of person based upon the actions of even your family. And you didn't want to bring shame to your family. So, for example, the story of Jesus turning the water into wine there in the Gospel of John. Well, cool, he run out of wine. Great, yeah, that's nice. So what? Well, the issue there really was going to be this. The family was responsible for, in that culture, providing a certain amount of wine and the things around the wedding feast. If they failed to uphold what was considered to be their expected contribution, they would have been looked upon as a community as somehow deficient. It would have been a shameful thing for them to run out. And they would have been, in many ways, blackballed in that community for a long time based upon their failure to uphold their responsibilities. It would have been not just an embarrassment, it would have been a shameful thing. So when Jesus turns the water into wine, he rescues them from the shame of their failure. They failed. They were going to fail to do what they were expected to do. They missed the mark. And Jesus rescues them from out of that. So if you're in that culture and you realize what Jesus has done, I think, by the way, it's one of the reasons that miracle is not widely known. The only ones who really know about it are the servants and the disciples. No one else knows. Why is that? Because Jesus is trying to protect the family. He doesn't want them to be shamed. The Bible talks about part of what God does for us and rescuing us from our sin and saving us. Yes, we're saved in a guilt innocence type of way. God takes away our guilt that replaces it with the innocence and the holiness of Christ. But he also takes away our shame. And for you and I, oh, that's neat. I like that. But there are parts of the world, that's actually the big deal. To have shame removed and honor restored. And the truth is, even when someone forgives, and in many cultures, in many honor shame cultures, there may be certain rituals or things that have to be done to restore honor. But even if someone forgives you, if you're genuinely ashamed of what you've done, you still feel that, don't you? Even if someone says to you, I don't see that anymore, I forgive you, for me, it's not a big deal. In your own heart, you can still feel the shame. And this is one of those powerful things here for us to remember tonight, even though this is not the point of this passage. The Bible says that God removes our shame. And when we hold on to it, we're missing out on what God is trying to actually do. And when we won't let someone else live it down, then we're playing the role of the devil. And that we're the accuser at that point in time. But in this instance, Paul says, listen, we want them to be ashamed of what they've done. We want them to be ashamed of this activity. And do that as a brother. You're not excommunicating them, so to speak. You're trying to bring them back into line of where they need to be so they can properly represent the gospel of Christ and be properly related to the body of Christ. So there can be unity. And we're definitely not going to jump into this tonight, but there is in here just a touch of it. I think you see it elsewhere. What I and others have sometimes called the theology of work. The Bible has much to say, by the way, about the role of work. We were created to work. Now, we may forget, if we go all the way back to Genesis, we think about the curse that God placed upon Adam. And part of Adam's curse was to have to do what? To work. And weeds are going to start growing up and this and that. But here's the thing. Did Adam have jobs to do before Genesis chapter 3's curse? Yes. The curse isn't work. The curse was hard labor. God made it harder. There's every indication that before the curse, before Adam sinned, there were still jobs to do. There were still roles to play. There was still stuff to be done. The garden still had to be tended. There just wasn't weeds. The ground didn't fight you, so to speak. So that to be said, those whose vision of heaven is that we're going to be sitting there just singing songs all day long. I don't think it's like, I think we will have roles to play. We will have things to do. We will have tasks to accomplish. I think we will be living in a society and a culture that just happens to be exactly what God intended for it to be. But we'll have things to do. We'll have roles to fulfill. Now, that's a whole sermon series, but short and sweet, here it is this. Paul is still concerned about the reputation of Christ, the unity of the church, and in this instance we have, for whatever reason, some who are just living off the work of others. And Paul says, stop it. If you're watching with us online tonight, thank you for hanging in there with my raspy voice. Hope you can actually hear it. I also hope you'll be here on with us on Sunday morning as we continue our study in 1 Peter. Y'all have a good evening.